Miss Jane Marple arrived in Tredevan with the soft resolve of someone accustomed to being quietly welcomed and gently overlooked. The little Cornish village, cradled between sloping moorland and a salt-rubbed coastline, had the faded dignity of a once fashionable place now turned inward. Stone cottages sat at deliberate angles beneath thatched roofs, and geraniums bloomed defiantly in windows overlooking the sea. She had come to visit Elspeth Grant, a school friend from Cheltenham days, now widowed and comfortably settled in a weathered Georgian house that looked out toward Penharrow Bay. They had corresponded for years, postcards, recipes, modest updates. But the tone had changed in recent months. A certain heaviness lingered in Elspeth's letters, subtle but unmistakable. As they sat beside the fire that first afternoon, Elspeth poured tea into thin china cups, her hands still elegant despite the trembling that came with age. "You'll find us quieter than St. Mary Mead, I dare say," she said with a half-smile, "but not, perhaps, entirely dull." Miss Marple, who never found quiet places dull, inclined her head and listened, not merely to the words, but to the pauses between them. Tredevan, she suspected, had its own rhythms of silence, and silence often concealed more than it revealed. 2 mornings later, a square cream envelope arrived at the breakfast table. Elspeth opened it with a small sound of surprise. "The Harvest Ball," she murmured, "at Penharrow House. I had rather thought they'd done away with these." Miss Marple looked up from buttering her toast. "Penharrow House? Oh yes, the old Trevorrow estate. Quite the thing in its day. Naval officers and summer visitors. Lady Marjorie lives there now, alone except for her companion. They say the house is rather grand still, though the money's mostly gone." The invitation stirred a ripple through the village. It was not merely a dance, it was a gesture of continuity, a signal that the past still clung to the corners of Tredevan like sea mist. Everyone who mattered would be there, and a few who did not. Miss Marple, politely included as Elspeth's guest, tucked the card into her handbag and remarked how pleasant it was to see old customs preserved. Penharrow House stood aloof above the bay, its stone facade veiled in ivy, and the scent of wood smoke drifting from unseen chimneys. Lanterns hung at the entrance, and within, the ballroom flickered with the glow of candlelight, caught in the gilt of age-spotted mirrors. The villagers had dressed with care, lace, brooches, polished shoes, and the air was thick with perfume, nostalgia, and the faint undertow of salt. Lady Marjorie Trevorrow appeared just before the music began. Slender and upright despite her 70-odd years, she wore a gown of faded sapphire, her silver hair arranged with the precision of someone who had once entertained royalty. She moved with stately confidence, smiling only with her eyes, and remained largely silent throughout the evening. Her companion, Miss Juliet Finch, hovered near but never interfered. Miss Marple sat along the wall with other older ladies and widowers, content to observe. She noted the greetings, the avoided glances, the couple who danced a little too formally. She noted, too, the way Lady Marjorie looked at the piano player during a Chopin piece. Not with admiration, but something else entirely. It was during the final waltz, as the clock neared 11, that the room changed. Lady Marjorie, standing at the center of the floor, turned once, twice, and crumpled soundlessly, her hand clutched to her side, the music faltering around her. A murmur rose. Someone called for a doctor. Juliet knelt beside her mistress, her face frozen in helpless shock. The ball was over, permanently. While the guests crowded near the doorway, some stunned, others already murmuring platitudes, Miss Marple remained seated. There was no need to bustle. People rarely noticed a quiet elderly lady in the background. She observed Juliet Finch's trembling hands as she stood, one still gloved, the other bare. The gloved one had clutched a wineglass not 5 minutes before. Now, it bore a faint imprint of tension, a whiteness about the knuckles, as though it had not merely held, but gripped. As others turned their attentions to the distraught companion, Miss Marple's gaze shifted to a handkerchief on the floor beneath the sideboard. Pale blue linen, monogrammed and slightly crumpled, as if it had been pressed into a fist and dropped in haste. No one seemed to notice it. She made a mental note of its placement, its delicate embroidery, and the fact that Juliet had dabbed her eyes earlier with something entirely different, a fine lace-edged square of white cotton. Grief, Miss Marple knew, often left people untidy in their habits, but not Juliet Finch. Juliet was a woman of order, and when order breaks, it is often because something, however small, has been disturbed. The gathering dispersed with practiced courtesy. Guests offered condolences, made their way into the cool night, and spoke of strokes, of weak hearts, of how sudden these things always were. Miss Marple said little. She accepted a shawl from Elspeth and allowed herself to be guided home, her expression as serene as ever. But her mind lingered on a single image, the clench of Juliet's gloved hand around the stem of a glass, and the color of the handkerchief on the floor. Grief could be sharp, but guilt, she knew, was sharper still, and infinitely more difficult to fold away unseen. The vicarage garden, with its spreading fig tree and sun-bleached trestle tables, hosted the annual charity tea 2 days after Lady Marjorie's death. It should have been a gentle affair. Linen tablecloths, murmured gratitude, and the clinking of teacups. But that afternoon, the jam ran cold on the scones, and conversations had a sharper edge. "She'd seemed perfectly well," muttered Mrs. Nankervis, adjusting her gloves and peering at the vicar's azalea bed. "Danced the waltz without a tremor, then down like a felled tree." "No warning at all," echoed Mr. Latham, polishing his spectacles. "Though someone said she'd been upset that week. A letter, or a caller, can't recall which." The vicar, ever the diplomat, tried to steer conversation back to parish matters, but curiosity had already taken root. Rumors spread like ivy on a church wall. Miss Marple sat quietly near the table of preserves, sipping her tea and listening, not eavesdropping, merely attentive. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that what people didn't say, what they skipped over, or repeated too often meant more than any direct accusation. And today, the word hot was used too frequently, as if it were a charm to ward off darker thoughts. She watched the faces as they spoke, some animated, some evasive. One or two, particularly the companion, Miss Finch, looked pale in the way grief seldom accounts for. Her death in public invites scrutiny, and when it happens mid-waltz, beneath chandeliers, suspicion waltzes in too. It was in the churchyard the following day that Miss Marple overheard the more delicate thread of the gossip. 2 women lingered near the old Trevorrow family plot, voices lowered but insistent. She was never the same after that business with Alice Weatherby. You remember? The engagement, broken suddenly. The boy went away and poor Alice left the village by Christmas. "I heard Lady Marjorie tore up the banns herself," said the girl's father was in trade. Well, that and the business about the uniform. Something didn't sit right. They say the boy never wrote again. Miss Marple moved on, her hands clasped before her, eyes drifting over the weathered stones. She remembered Alice Weatherby faintly, sweet-tempered, with a talent for watercolors and a fragile mother who rarely left the parlor. The son in question, Anthony Trevorrow, had been the village's golden boy before the war took him, but the engagement had ended abruptly. and his fate overseas was shrouded in confusion. Killed, presumed missing, some whispered suicide. What was certain was this: Alice had left Tredevan with nothing more than a suitcase and a bowed head, and Lady Marjorie had never spoken her name again. A memory buried, but not forgotten. That afternoon, as Miss Marple took her knitting into Elspeth Grant's orchard, she noticed a figure beneath the pear tree. It was Miss Finch, Lady Marjorie's companion, seated on the grass, her face turned away, one hand pressed to her eyes. She was not weeping loudly. It was the restrained, private kind of grief, born of exhaustion and things unsaid. Miss Marple paused, made the soft rustle of approach known, but Juliet did not startle. She simply straightened slightly and said, "It's quite all right, Miss Marple. I'm just tired." Miss Marple sat a respectful distance away. It's often the days after that are most difficult, when the silence begins. Juliet nodded, her gaze fixed on a patch of sunlight. She wasn't an easy woman, but she was precise. Life had its boxes, and she kept them all neatly sealed. A pause. Then, almost to herself, Juliet murmured, "I wish some of them had stayed sealed. Things that cannot be unsaid, even if meant in kindness." Miss Marple said nothing. It was not her way to press. But as she rose to leave, she glanced at Juliet's lap. There was a letter clutched loosely in her hand, half-creased, its seal unbroken. A letter unread, or one memorized and carried like a stone. Not all grief was fresh. Some had simply ripened into silence. Sergeant Trenwith had the air of a man trying earnestly to impress. Fresh from Exeter, neatly uniformed and painfully eager, he interviewed the villagers with diligence and a pad far too new for Tredevan's weathered hearts. He questioned the vicar's housekeeper about seating arrangements at the ball. He asked the postmistress if any stranger had collected parcels for Lady Marjorie. He even questioned Miss Marple, politely, with an air of learned deference. "She was old, wasn't she?" he said. "Heart, perhaps, though the doctor seems uncertain. But if there was a quarrel earlier that week, it may explain a great deal." Miss Marple, gently stirring her tea, responded, "The body is quite reliable at signaling distress, but it doesn't always indicate why, especially when others are determined not to notice." He blinked at that, jotted something down, and thanked her. He was kind, respectful, but too young to catch the drift in a widow's smile or the tremor behind a "no trouble at all." Miss Marple watched him go with something between fondness and resignation. He had logic, certainly. What he lacked was experience in the currency of the village, gesture, omission, and memory. And memory, she knew, could sting deeper than poison. In the parish hall where the women's circle met for needlework and ration-stretching tips, a dusty cupboard held scrapbooks and photographs, long untouched. That Thursday, while searching for bunting, Mrs. Brentwood uncovered a cardboard box of ballroom pictures, snapshots of the harvest ball from years past. The photographs were passed around, admired with soft laughter and mild embarrassment. But one in particular caught Miss Marple's eye. Her group portrait from 1946. Lady Marjorie in a dark gown, young Anthony beside her, and next to him, a girl with high cheekbones and wide, serious eyes. Elspeth frowned as she peered over her shoulder. "That's not Alice Weatherby. That's someone else entirely." "No name written?" Miss Marple asked softly. "None. But look, Juliet Finch is there too, at the far edge. She would have been very young." Miss Marple studied the photograph. The unnamed girl was half-turned, as though uncertain of her place. But what drew her attention most was the expression on Lady Marjorie's face. Tense, guarded, not quite pride, not quite disapproval. A photograph captures the surface, but even in sepia, shadows collect behind smiles, and sometimes it is the person missing from a picture who tells the truest story. It was little Toby Henstridge who found the medal, digging near the lavender bed while his mother chatted with the cook at Penharrow. A naval medal, dulled with age, half buried beneath the roots. Toby presented it proudly to his mother, who passed it on to the gardener, who brought it to Juliet Finch. Miss Marple heard of it later from Elspeth. "Odd thing," she said, pouring tea. "It's not Sir Robert's. Different initials. A MT, they think. No idea who it belonged to." "IMT," Miss Marple repeated quietly. "Anthony Michael Trevorrow." Elspeth blinked. "Yes, I suppose it could be. But why would it be buried in the garden?" "Children lose buttons," Miss Marple said. "Adults lose things more deliberately." The medal's reappearance, after decades and so near to Lady Marjorie's death, raised more than questions. It whispered of remembrance not meant to endure, of tokens discarded to silence a past that refused to remain buried. Juliet had accepted the medal without comment, placed it in her apron pocket, and continued with her day. But later that evening, Miss Marple saw her sitting alone on the terrace, the medal turning slowly in her fingers. Grief, guilt, memory, all weighty things. But a medal, after all, is meant to be worn. Penharrow House, in the softened light of late morning, seemed less imposing than it had by candlelight. The drawing room where Juliet Finch received Miss Marple was quiet, orderly, and touched by an austere elegance. Every book in its place, every curtain tied just so. But there was a stillness in the air that felt less like peace, and more like preservation. Juliet, though pale and composed, wore signs of a restless night. She poured tea with steady hands, but her voice faltered when she offered the sugar bowl. "She never stopped hoping," she said abruptly, after a moment of silence. "Even when there was no word for years. She would speak of him in the present tense, as if he might still walk through that door." "You mean her son, Anthony?" Miss Marple asked with gentleness. Juliet nodded. "He was declared missing, presumed dead. But Lady Marjorie never accepted it. I think—" She hesitated. "I think she believed someone in the village knew something, that someone had failed him, or failed her perhaps." Miss Marple did not press. She listened as Juliet spoke of telegrams, of letters unanswered, of hopes folded neatly into drawers and revisited each Christmas. There are griefs so old they forget to weep. But Miss Marple recognized their weight in Juliet's posture, in the fine lines around her mouth. Penharrow House had kept its secrets under lock and key, but some had been carried inside the heart, too well hidden to be lost. After tea, Juliet offered to show Miss Marple the garden. They walked slowly along the yew-lined path that led toward the west wing, where the sun filtered through the glass, like weak tea. Juliet paused outside a closed door. "His room," she said softly. She never let anyone sleep there, not even when the house was full in the summer months. Juliet hesitated, then turned the handle. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a chamber preserved with such care it seemed untouched by time. A naval jacket hung beside the wardrobe. Books on maritime law lined the shelves. A cricket bat leaned beside a wooden chest. "She dusted it herself," Juliet said. "Even in winter. Said she'd know if anything had been moved." Miss Marple stepped no further, but her eyes took in every detail. The pillow precisely fluffed, the inkpot still full, the calendar above the desk stopped in 1945. She believed he might return, but she also feared what he might bring with him, what truths he might tell. Miss Marple's voice was mild, but her words met a silent tremor in Juliet's expression. Grief leaves room for hope, but guilt leaves only the door ajar, just enough to hear the footsteps that never come. Along the eastern edge of the village, Willow Cottage had stood empty for some time, its hedges unruly, its gate leaning slightly askew. When Eleanor Radcliffe arrived, she brought with her a certain quiet refinement. She was not young, but there was something striking in her bearing, elegant without affectation, and polite with a studied detachment. The villagers were pleased to see the old place occupied, but questions followed close behind. She had taken the cottage for 6 months, paid in advance, and received only the vicar for a formal welcome. She declined the invitation to the harvest ball, citing a preference for solitude. "She's not unfriendly," Mrs. Channing told Miss Marple at the greengrocer's, "but reserved. I'd wager she's from London, or perhaps from abroad. There's a sorrow in her face." Miss Marple thanked her and noted the observation. Elena Radcliffe's name meant nothing to her, and yet the woman's manner lingered in the mind. There was something familiar in the tilt of her head, in the way she paused before replying, as if weighing each word. Tredivan was not unkind, but it was not forgetful either, and a new face often carried with it an old story. One simply had to wait for it to emerge. Sunday brought a bracing wind, and the usual procession of villagers to morning service. Miss Marple, in a tweed coat and sensible hat, lingered by the lich gate after communion, her gloves clasped neatly in one hand. Elena Radcliffe approached with her head slightly bowed, her steps measured. Miss Marple offered a pleasant greeting, and remarked on the hymn, "Lead, Kindly Light," and how she had once heard it played, rather beautifully, at a wartime remembrance service. "Yes," Elena replied, her voice scarcely above the breeze. "It was played at Portsmouth, I believe. December 1945. She seemed to catch herself, and her face went still. "I wasn't there, of course," she added quickly. "Only heard of it." Miss Marple tilted her head gently. "Indeed, it was quite moving. The choir sang with such feeling." Elena nodded politely, and excused herself with murmured grace. But as she passed through the churchyard gate, Miss Marple noted how her hand trembled ever so slightly, just enough to disturb the line of her coat. There is a particular kind of grief that sharpens at remembrance, more reflex than memory, more wound than scar. Miss Marple watched her go, and knew Eleanor Radcliffe had not merely declined the harvest ball, she had fled it. The following day Miss Marple joined Elspeth Grant at the Women's Institute, where a quilting circle was underway. As stitches passed and stories flowed, the name Radcliffe surfaced amid talk of rationing and recipe substitutions. "My cousin saw her once, years ago," said Mrs. Denby, her needle pausing mid-air. "At a naval officer's ball in Devon, said she danced with a lieutenant. Handsome fellow, dark hair. Looked like he belonged on a magazine cover." Someone laughed, but Mrs. Denby's expression turned thoughtful. She said there was something strange about it. The lady, Elena, was dressed in borrowed pearls, and when they called the final waltz, she left suddenly, vanished practically. My cousin always wondered why. Miss Marple inquired softly, "Did your cousin happen to remember the officer's name?" A pause, then a shrug. "No, only that his mother disapproved. She said it showed on her face, like a curtain dropped behind the eyes." Later, walking home, Miss Marple considered the fragments: a dance, a disapproving mother, a vanished girl, and now a returned woman with veiled eyes. Ballrooms, she mused, had long been theaters of heartbreak. Her dance could mark the beginning of love, or the end of everything, And some endings were not announced. They simply folded themselves into memory, to be rediscovered by those who knew where to look. Late that evening, a flicker of firelight from Penharrow's parlour drew Miss Marple's attention from the garden path. Through the parted curtains, she glimpsed Juliet at the hearth, a pile of papers in her lap, feeding them slowly to the flames. Letters, some still sealed, others folded with evident care, disappeared into the grate one by one, ash curling upward like the smoke of old sins. The next morning, when Miss Marple gently asked if Juliet had slept, the younger woman replied with a dry smile, "I dreamed of sea mist and forgotten songs. Perhaps it's the weather." Miss Marple nodded, saying nothing, but before parting, Juliet's voice caught the air like the last note of a hymn. She feared someone would return. She said it often these past weeks, not in anger, in dread. She believed truth was a thing best buried, but it has a habit of rising. Miss Marple placed a hand on her wrist. Sometimes it rises not to accuse, but to ask for peace. Juliet did not respond, but her eyes shimmered in the lamplight. There are truths that arrive too late to change the past, yet they demand to be heard, if only so the dead may rest, and the living, at last, may breathe. Mr. Lyle was a man of the old soil, stooped, slow-footed, with skin like weathered bark, and hands that still bore the memory of shears and trowels. Miss Marple found him on the bench beneath the fig tree behind Penharrow House, a woolen blanket over his knees, and a flask of strong tea at his side. "It's not the years," he said, tapping his temple. "It's the noises I remember, not the words, just the way they sounded." Miss Marple smiled softly. "A gardener often hears things the rest of us are too polite to notice." Mr. Lyle chuckled at that. "That's truth. I was trimming the lilac hedge Tuesday last. Late afternoon. Didn't mean to eavesdrop, but they were right above me. Her ladyship and someone else. A man's voice. Low. Like he didn't want to be heard, but angry. And her. She was firm, fierce even. Do you remember anything they said? Just one thing. She said, 'You have no claim. Not now. Not ever.' Then something about the past staying where it belonged." Miss Marple thanked him kindly and walked back through the orchard path, the air rich with damp leaves. She had long since learned that gardeners buried more than bulbs, and sometimes what they remembered took root in very inconvenient seasons. Miss Marple visited the village hall that afternoon, under the pretense of donating old linens to the Harvest Relief Fund. While the vicar's niece arranged the piles, she asked quietly if the committee files from the war years were still kept, for the sake of parish history. She was directed to a locked cabinet beside the coat stand, and with polite persistence and her usual unthreatening charm, she soon found herself seated before a yellowing box file marked Wartime Board Correspondence. One letter stood out. It was addressed to the Regional Pension Authority, and bore Lady Marjorie Trevorrow's firm, recognizable script. "I must inform you, with the greatest reluctance, that the character of Lieutenant A.M.T. is gravely in question. I do not believe his conduct merits honorable mention, nor, regrettably, continued public support." Miss Marple closed the file gently. Not cowardice, perhaps. Something else. A decision made in haste or pride. But there it was, a mother's signature on a letter that cost a man his pension, and possibly his name. The past, Miss Marple reflected, often has a clerkish neatness about it. But when one lifts the sheet, the blot beneath tells another story entirely. The war memorial in Tredovon stood modestly beside the chapel, a granite pillar with names etched in solemn rows. Villagers passed it daily, most without notice. But Miss Marple paused that day, her eyes scanning the list. "Strange, isn't it?" murmured Mrs. Pell, who had joined her from the baker's. I remember Anthony Trevorrow's name being there. I'm certain of it. And now, gone. Perhaps it was never inscribed. Miss Marple offered mildly. Mrs. Pell frowned. No, no. My brother served with him. Said he died in service, but something odd happened. They wouldn't talk about it. Even after the war, there was this quiet around it. Another voice joined in. Mr. Rudge, a retired clerk. I recall the carving was changed, chipped out and redone in 52. No one explained it. Miss Marple simply nodded and thanked them. Erasure is a particular kind of silence, more deliberate than forgetting. And here, in a village that remembered nearly everything, the absence of a name made more noise than any bell. The missing were mourned, always. But the disowned, they faded by design, and Penharrow House, it seemed, had long practiced the art of removing what no longer suited the story. The church was empty when Miss Marple entered, save for the soft scuffle of the verger arranging hymnals. She moved slowly through the pews, the hush inviting reflection, until something caught her eye, tucked beneath the pages of hymns ancient and modern. A folded envelope, yellowed with time. No address, only a set of initials in faded ink. AMT. She opened it with careful hands. My dearest, I write this without knowing if the letter will ever find you. I no longer know which face of mine you remember, or whether any kindness lingers in your thoughts of me. But I must say it plainly. I failed you. I stood beside silence when I should have spoken, and now the silence is all I have. They say we must accept the past. I do not. I only carry it. If you ever return, and I pray you do, know that it was not hatred but fear that kept me from your side. There was no signature, only a final line. Forgive me, if it's still within you to do so. Miss Marple held the letter a long time. It bore the unmistakable voice of a woman who had loved and lost, and whose guilt had hollowed her into caution. And it was dated 1 week before the day Anthony Trevorrow was said to have disappeared. The Reverend Harwood was a gentleman, fond of rose cuttings and sermons without fuss. He welcomed Miss Marple for tea that afternoon, and seemed almost relieved when she turned the talk toward days past. There was an oddity, yes, he admitted, stirring his tea too long. I recall Lady Marjorie once came to me in some distress. It was 1946, I think. She wished to know whether the bans for a certain union had been read. I told her no, they had not. She seemed satisfied. Was there a wedding intended? Miss Marple asked softly. There may have been. But she made it quite clear that, if spoken of, it would cause irreparable harm to the family's name. He looked pained. I was young then, eager to serve, not to question. Do you recall the name? He shook his head. Only the initials, AMT. It struck me then that I had seen them elsewhere. A naval report, perhaps. Miss Marple nodded, thanking him gently. Clergy, like gardens, grew most things well, but some truths, once planted, were left to rot quietly beneath the roots, smothered not by lies, but by obedience. That evening Miss Marple returned to Elspeth Grant's parlor as the wind rustled the curtains and the mantel clock ticked with stubborn precision. She sat in the quiet, hands folded on her lap, her gaze fixed not on the fire, but on the still air between the chimes. Outside, life went on. Children's voices, the creak of a bicycle, the clatter of a latch. But within, only memory moved. Anthony Trevorrow had not died in the war, or not in the way they'd been told. He had returned, or tried to, and what he found waiting was not welcome, but silence. A mother more concerned with honor than reconciliation. A woman, perhaps two, who loved him, but but failed him in different, equally permanent ways. Miss Marple had seen such patterns before, not the act of murder, but the slow layering of guilt and shame that made it possible. Not rage, but self-preservation masked in duty. The clock chimed again. Lady Marjorie had denounced her own son. She had buried his name, erased his honor, and silenced the only two women who had tried to love him back into life. Some murders, Miss Marple thought, begin not with poison, but with pride. The solicitor's office in Tredevan, housed in a modest Georgian building behind the post, had rarely known excitement. Its dusty ledgers and mahogany desks had settled into a rhythm of land deeds, wills, and the occasional contested fence boundary. So, when Mr. Doughty arrived to find the filing cabinet unlocked and one drawer ajar, the event stirred more curiosity than alarm. Nothing was missing, no drawer forced, the petty cash tin untouched. But Mr. Doughty's clerk, young and sharp-eyed, noticed something unusual. A file on wartime pension appeals, stamped "Reviewed, 1947", had been shifted out of order. Its metal tag bent, as if hastily replaced. By noon, whispers passed from the post office queue to the butcher's till. Who would want an old military file? And why? Miss Marple, sipping tea at Elspeth's side, said nothing at first, but that evening she strolled past the solicitor's office and noted something most had not: a narrow footprint in the garden bed beneath the open side window. Not large, perhaps a woman's. It is not the breaking that signals intent, Miss Marple reflected. It is what is chosen, what is touched, and most of all, what is returned. For returning something often tells more about guilt than theft ever could. The vicar's wife was the first to notice the silence. Juliet Finch had not collected her morning bread. Her curtains were drawn well past 9. And when Mrs. Featherstone called with a basket of handkerchiefs in need of mending, she found the parlor vacant, the fire unlit. "She's gone," the housekeeper reported later that afternoon. Left a note, said she needed air and time, no forwarding address, only that she'd write when settled. Miss Marple listened quietly, her knitting resting in her lap. Did she take much? Only one valise. And her gloves? Elspeth raised her brows. Gloves? It's June. Miss Marple said nothing, but her thoughts wandered back to the evening of the harvest ball, to Juliet's gloved hand gripping the wineglass, to the linen handkerchief dropped in haste, and now an empty room, a vanished woman, and a silence too perfectly timed. In villages such as Tredevan, absences create louder echoes than footsteps. Departure without goodbye is rarely innocent, and often not final. Dr. Brent had been Lady Marjorie's physician for 15 years, a quiet, methodical man who preferred the company of birds to people, and rarely speculated beyond what his thermometer or stethoscope allowed. Yet when Miss Marple called upon him that morning, ostensibly to ask after Elspeth's blood pressure, he surprised her with a remark spoken almost to himself. She was strong, you know, for her age. Blood pressure stable, heart consistent. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. So I'd heard. Dr. Brent paused. The post-mortem came back yesterday. There were traces, very slight but detectable. Digitalis, Miss Marple looked up. In her sherry. Not enough for habitual dose. Enough to trouble a system unaccustomed to it. Enough to stop a heart if taken swiftly. There was silence, broken only by the scratch of his pen. She didn't have a prescription, he added, almost apologetically. Nor did anyone in the house. Miss Marple rose, her expression unchanged. Such things, when misplaced, can cause great confusion, especially when used with intention. He looked up, startled. And sometimes, she added gently, The most dangerous poison lies not in the bottle, but in the belief that justice is owed to the dead more than to the living. It was Mrs. Pembroke, the organist's widow, who brought it up during tea at the church hall. "Helena Radcliffe," she said, pouring milk with a slow hand. "I knew I'd seen her before, at the officers' gala in Plymouth, just before the war ended." Others around the table leaned in. She wore navy blue, with a brooch like a ship's wheel, danced with a tall young lieutenant, very handsome, very quiet, the sort who didn't need to say much. "Do you recall his name?" asked Miss Marple as though idly. Mrs. Pembroke frowned. "Trevor. No, Trevorrow. Yes, Anthony Trevorrow. The son." There was a pause. "Lady Marjorie attended, didn't she?" Someone asked. "Oh, yes. Arrived halfway through. Stood at the edge of the ballroom. I'll never forget her face when she saw them dancing, like stone. She didn't speak to either of them. Just left." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And Elena?" "Gone by the second waltz. Some said she took ill. Others, well, we all know what heartbreak looks like." Miss Marple nodded. Dances can be beginnings, or they can be farewells in disguise. And in the hush of a ballroom, long before a note is played, the partners already know whether they'll finish the song or let go before the music ends. Elena was in her garden when Miss Marple arrived, tending to a row of pale irises with gloved hands and an expression of remote calm. "You've done wonders with the border," Miss Marple offered warmly. "They say irises are temperamental." "They are," Elena replied, "but once they choose to bloom, they're generous." They spoke a while of bulbs and shade, of Cornish soil and its refusal to hurry anything. And then quite gently, Miss Marple turned the conversation. "I believe you danced once, in Plymouth, with a young officer whose name was later struck from a memorial." Elena did not flinch. She merely turned one iris stalk, repositioning it. "Anthony was kind," she said softly, "and frightened. We both were." "And Lady Marjorie?" A pause. "She was a woman who preferred absence to explanation." Miss Marple said nothing more. The next morning Elena did not attend chapel. Her seat remained unfilled, and a single stem of iris, pale as salt, rested by the churchyard gate. Sometimes silence is not retreat, it is respect. Sometimes it is the only way one knows how to mourn what one was never permitted to claim. By week's end the village had changed, not in form, but in posture. Glances that had once been warm became cautious. Flowers once sent to Penharrow ceased, and the pew behind the font sat curiously empty. Mrs. Denby no longer paused to gossip outside the greengrocer. Mr. Latham took a different route home from the post, and even the vicar's smile when speaking of Lady Marjorie had taken on a certain stiffness, as though trying to balance kindness with the unspoken weight of knowledge. Miss Marple watched it all unfold from the bakery queue, from the bench beneath the chestnut, from the window seats at Elspeth's. It was not hostility, it was discomfort, the unease that follows when a tidy narrative begins to fray, and one realizes that respectability, like varnish, can crack under too much light. She had seen it before. In St. Mary Mead, in Milchester, in Market Basing. A village, like a garden, often prunes too neatly, cutting away not what is harmful but what doesn't suit. And now, Tredevan was rearranging itself, not with violence, but with careful, quiet judgment, which, Miss Marple reflected, can be the most enduring kind of punishment. Miss Marple had long understood that the post office of any village was more than a place of envelopes and stamps. It was the quiet heart of correspondence, the pulse of what people chose to say, and perhaps more tellingly, what they did not. She arrived just after the midday lull, greeted Mrs. Rudge with a gentle inquiry about knitting patterns, and idled with the air of one not in any particular hurry. "Oh, there was a letter posted under the name E. Rawdon last week," Mrs. Rudge offered offhandedly. "Not one of ours. From the Radcliffe woman, I believe. Strange, that name. Rawdon. Sounds borrowed, doesn't it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, or perhaps remembered. As she moved to collect a parcel for Elspeth, her eye caught a half-sorted stack of holiday postcards. One had slipped aside, a view of Portsmouth Harbour, captioned in faded ink. The message was brief, but the handwriting unmistakable. Angular, careful, familiar. Miss Marple had seen it before, on the unsent love letter she'd found in the hymnal. It bore no signature, but it closed with the words, "Yours still, as before the waltz." The waltz. Not a dance, she thought now, but a turning, a moment from which two people never quite turned back, and one of them had written again. At the village schoolhouse, Miss Marple's pretext was unassuming. Elspeth had spoken of old-school scrapbooks in need of cataloguing, and so she found herself in the company of Miss Ackland, the headmistress, sorting through decades of yellowing records and curled photographs. Near the bottom of one folder marked, "Evacuees, 1944, a black-and-white image caught her attention. A group of older girls lined up outside the rectory, unsmiling, marked only by the faint pencil scrawl on the back. Billeted at Trevorrow House, March 1944. The face was younger, but the eyes were the same. Elena Radcliffe, then bearing the name Eleanor Mason. Her hair was darker, tied with ribbon, and beside her stood a naval officer not yet 20. The man's likeness was difficult to miss. Anthony Trevorrow. Miss Marple said nothing aloud, but in her mind a line was drawn, not dotted, but continuous. They had known each other long before that final waltz. She had been hidden in plain sight, under a different name. Before she ever arrived at Willow Cottage, the village had not seen her before. It had simply forgotten to look. The local bank, a modest affair nestled beside the haberdashers, was manned by Mr. Hewitt, a man of practical charm and careful speech. Miss Marple, inquiring politely about an account related to the church roof fund, mentioned quite offhandedly a rumor of Lady Marjorie's final donation. "Oh, yes," said Mr. Hewitt. "Rather odd that. A check issued 3 days after the funeral. We flagged it, of course." He fetched the logbook and laid it open. There it was. Lady Marjorie's name, her elegant slanted signature, dated unmistakably after her death. The check had been modest in amount, £50, but the recipient's name had raised no fewer eyebrows. "Juliet Finch," Miss Marple read softly. "Drawn in person. Number deposited at a branch in Exeter. Couriered, they believe. We followed up, but by then Miss Finch had already gone." Miss Marple thanked him and made her way back to Elspeth's garden. Juliet had written no goodbyes, but this check was a message nonetheless. Not theft. No. Something nearer to a final claim, or perhaps a statement of truth. Only the living could move money, but only the haunted could sign for the dead. Whatever she had taken, it was not for wealth. It was for proof, and in its quiet way. That made it infinitely more dangerous. The parish lending library was as small as it was dependable. On rainy afternoons it smelt faintly of lavender polish and dust. Miss Marple wandered its narrow shelves under the pretense of seeking a novel for Elspeth, though her interest lay elsewhere. She located the naval memoirs of Rear Admiral Seaton, still shelved under local interest, and withdrew it carefully. It fell open, naturally, as books do, to a chapter on the Channel Mutiny of 1944. And there, in the margin, were faint annotations in pencil. One comment read, "False charge. Captain's orders disputed." Another later, "If only she had listened. AMT." Miss Marple turned the page and studied the note slant. Identical to the postcard. Identical to the love letter. It was Anthony Trevorrow's hand. Someone had borrowed the book unofficially, read it quietly, and returned it unrecorded. And in doing so, they had left their mark, not only on the paper but on the entire story. No trial, no tribunal, no disgrace, only misunderstanding. And the echo of a mother's pride, louder than justice. That evening, Miss Marple and Elspeth walked the perimeter of the garden. The hedges were thick, untrimmed, and bent by salt wind. "Elspeth," Miss Marple said softly, "do you remember the story of the Tredavon maze?" "Oh yes, a foolish local tale of a boy who vanished in the hedges and was presumed drowned until he was found 3 days later asleep in the center." "But he hadn't drowned," Miss Marple mused. "He'd simply followed the wrong turn and hadn't cried out." Elspeth smiled faintly. "They said he wasn't lost, just overlooked." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, that seems to happen often here." Some stories, she reflected, are not misremembered. They are conveniently remembered. Lady Marjorie had built her own hedge maze, not of greenery, but of silence, formality, and forgotten names. And those who wandered from her path were not seen again, not until someone cared to step beyond the box borders and peer in from above. And now, she thought, the path was almost clear. One more stitch, one more turn of the thread. Twilight settled over Elspeth Grant's parlor, and the sound of Miss Marple's needles was the only motion in the room. Outside, the sea whispered as it always had, uncaring, eternal. The pattern she worked was old, Irish lace, delicate and firm. But it was the rhythm that occupied her. The facts, once frayed, now drew into alignment. Anthony Trevorrow had returned under a different name. He had written, waited, tried. But his mother had refused him, not from hatred but from fear of what his presence meant. Truth, scandal, a past she could no longer reshape. Helena Ratcliffe had never truly left. She had returned quietly, not for revenge but remembrance, to walk once more where she had danced and bury what had never been grieved. And Juliet Finch. Juliet had watched all of it, had served a woman who punished love in the name of legacy, had seen her betray a son and ruin a name, and had known it was not accident, but will. She had slipped the poison not in hatred, but with a sense of restorative justice, not for herself, but for Anthony. Miss Marple's fingers paused. One thread remained. The next morning she would tie it off, with a steady hand and no bitterness, only clarity. The note arrived with modest formality, handwritten on Elspeth Grant stationery, and delivered by the vicar's boy. Miss Marple had requested the presence of a few individuals for a quiet and necessary matter to be addressed in the drawing-room at Penharrow House. There was no mention of accusation, nor of death, only the gentle insistence of someone who knew. It was time to speak plainly. And so they came. Sergeant Trenwith, his expression wary but curious. The vicar, grave and uncertain. Helena Ratcliffe, composed and silent. Mr. Doughty, the solicitor. Mrs. Channing, Mrs. Denby. Not a crowd, but a pattern. Each thread chosen with care. The drawing-room had been dusted, the fire laid, though not lit, and Lady Marjorie's portrait gazed out from above the mantel, her eyes unblinking, her poise untouched by the weeks of quiet tumult. Miss Marple sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, hands folded, a lace handkerchief resting in her lap. She did not raise her voice. She merely began. "There are stories," she said gently, "that are told to stretches too far. It becomes another name for concealment." No one interrupted her. They were ready. though not all would admit it, to hear what had waited far too long. Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice steady, each phrase measured like lacework laid thread by thread. Lady Marjorie's son, Anthony Michael Trevorrow, did not die at sea. He returned. Under a different name, perhaps in uniform still, but not to parade or proclamation. He returned privately, wounded not in flesh, but in spirit. There was a silence in the room, the kind that forms not from disbelief but from dawning recognition. His welcome was not what he'd hoped. He came not as a hero, but as a man bearing truth his mother would not accept, a truth she feared would ruin her household, her legacy, her name. Miss Marple looked at Elena, whose face betrayed nothing, but whose eyes no longer hid their ache. He was erased, Miss Marple continued, from plaques, from photographs, from stories told at tea. Not because he died dishonorably, but because he lived inconveniently. Mr. Doughty shifted uneasily. The vicar pressed his lips together. He stayed nearby for a time. Some knew him, others suspected, but when he grew ill there was no reconciliation. Lady Marjorie kept her silence. Her pride demanded it. And silence, Miss Marple added without needing to say it, has the habit of closing doors that might once have opened to grace. Miss Marple turned slightly, and her gaze rested on Eleanor Radcliffe. There was a photograph, she said, taken during the war, a dance at the officers' club, Lady Marjorie's son and a young woman, then called Eleanor Mason, standing beside him. Eleanor's eyes did not waver. She nodded once. "I loved him," she said quietly. "I never stopped." There was no shock in her voice, no appeal, only the kind of steadiness born of years spent managing the weight of a memory one was never permitted to speak aloud. "I came back to Tredevan, not to reclaim him," she added, "only to remember him, to see again the places he'd once known. I had hoped it might soothe something in me." The vicar looked down at his folded hands. Sergeant Trenwith frowned faintly but said nothing. Miss Marple offered the briefest of smiles. Grief expressed is hard enough, but grief denied a name becomes something else entirely. In villages such as Tredevan, the past is never far, and photographs are not just keepsakes. They are doors, ones we sometimes choose to lock. But Miss Marple had long understood how to find the keys, and when to open them gently. The room seemed to settle, as if waiting for the inevitable thread to be drawn tight. "Anthony Trevorrow died," Miss Marple said, "not in battle nor by misadventure. He succumbed to illness some months after his return, alone but not forgotten. He wrote, many times, letters unanswered. He left tokens, one of which was found recently in the garden border." She paused. Lady Marjorie knew. Whether she read his letters or merely feared them, she knew. And she said nothing. Mr. Doughty let out a slow breath. So he wasn't missing after all. "No," Miss Marple replied. "He was only lost to her." Eleanor's voice was soft. "I tried once to speak to her, to explain, but she said his name had no place in her house." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet she kept his room, dusted it, preserved it as a monument, not to his life, but to her version of it. Grief, she knew, has many disguises. Sometimes it calls itself loyalty, sometimes honor. But when it refuses to let the truth breathe, it becomes something darker. And for Lady Marjorie, the tragedy of her son's death was not that it occurred. It was that she allowed it to pass, unacknowledged. And so, Miss Marple continued, we come to Miss Juliet Finch." She looked not at anyone in particular, but her tone deepened, threading sorrow into each syllable. Juliet knew. Perhaps not all, but enough. She found the letters. She found the photo. She pieced together what had been concealed, and then she stayed. She stayed to serve, to care for a woman who had destroyed the very thing she had once loved. A murmur passed through the group, but no one spoke. "She did not leave out of guilt," Miss Marple said. "She left because her act had been completed." Sergeant Trenwith stirred. I mean, Miss Marple replied gently, "that Lady Marjorie's death was not a matter of heart alone. Digitalis, in the sherry, subtle, almost undetectable, but not accidental." Mrs. Denby's hand flew to her mouth. "She gave her peace," Miss Marple said, "though not the kind the law would define. Juliet believed that truth mattered more than punishment, that dignity, once stolen, must be returned." There was silence again, and then Elena softly, "He was worth it." Miss Marple met her eyes. He was, and Juliet knew that. It had not been vengeance, it had been reparation, the sort that arrives not with fury, but with a steady, sorrowful hand. No constable came to knock, no charges were filed. Sergeant Trenwith took his cap and left with the silence of a man who knew. Justice had already arrived by other means. The villagers returned to their homes slowly, without the customary murmurs. Even Mrs. Channing said nothing as she passed through the gate. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands still folded. Elspeth leaned close. "Do you think she'll write, Juliet?" Miss Marple shook her head. "I think she said all she meant to, in her own way." Helena stood, her back straight, but her face bore the grief of 2 decades. She placed something on the side table, a pressed iris, pale and dry. Then she too departed, without ceremony. The portrait above the hearth gazed down, unchanging. But the room, once governed by Lady Marjorie's unyielding presence, had softened. Shadows had moved. Miss Marple rose last. "Some truths," she thought, "are not meant for courtrooms. They are for drawing rooms, over tea and quiet comprehension. They are for the hearts of those who must live on, and those who must forgive in silence." She did not smile, but as she closed the door behind her, she breathed, deeply, and finally, without tension. The garden behind Elspeth Grant's cottage had begun to turn with the season. Ivy clung in bronze-hued trails along the trellis, and the scent of drying leaves mingled faintly with the perfume of overgrown mint. Miss Marple sipped her tea without hurry, her knitting tucked beside her, untouched. "It wasn't anger, was it?" Elspeth said at last. "Not really. What Juliet did?" Miss Marple looked ahead, not at her friend. "Number. It was something far sadder than that, a kind of despair that dresses itself in reason." Elspeth nodded slowly. "I sometimes think we see more clearly when we're older, but it's lonelier too." "Wisdom," Miss Marple murmured, "is a solitary comfort." The wind moved the ivy, and neither woman spoke for a while. "It never begins with cruelty," Miss Marple added gently. "Only with silence, and silence, when it festers, becomes unbearable." A clock chimed faintly from the parlor, but time had already lost its grip on that quiet hour. Eleanor Radcliffe left just before dawn, her bag light, her fare paid in coins set quietly beside the kettle. No one saw her board the early bus, and she had arranged for no goodbyes. There are exits that need no audience, only completion. Later that morning the vicar noticed it first. A white rose, stem pressed neatly into the soft earth by the gate of the churchyard. Its petals were not fresh, but preserved, as if chosen for memory rather than beauty. No note, no name. But it did not go unnoticed. Miss Marple passed it during her morning walk, and paused. She did not bend to touch it. She merely stood for a moment, letting her gaze rest where Eleanor's had likely stood before her. The rose said nothing, but its silence held grief, apology, and farewell, and perhaps in its own way, forgiveness, not to Lady Marjorie, but to time itself. By mid-November, Penharrow House had taken on a different air. The rooms had been scrubbed, the carpets aired, and cheerful curtains in floral print now framed the tall windows. A young couple from Exeter had taken the lease, delighted by the garden and the light in the upper bedrooms. They asked nothing of the house's history, nor did the villagers offer much. Stories, when uninvited, tend to stay quiet. Laughter began to echo faintly through the grounds again, not to erase what had been, but to continue what must. Innocence, Miss Marple often observed, is not ignorance. It is courage without memory. In her own garden in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple clipped a single rose, the last of the season, and held it for a moment before placing it among the others. It was imperfect, slightly bruised at the edge, but still it held its fragrance. She sat beside the flower bed, her mind not on death, but on grief, the kind that lingers unspoken, like a draught through a closed room. When grief is buried too deep, she murmured aloud, it grows roots in the wrong places. She folded her hands. Justice had been done, of a kind, but peace was always another matter entirely. Some stories do not end with a trial or a headline, but with a quiet cup of tea, a rose left in silence, and the knowledge that truth, once whispered aloud, can echo more loudly than any bell. In Tredevan, justice came not in handcuffs, but in a subtle rearranging of glances and pews, and in one old lady's lacework, stitching the sorrow behind respectable smiles. Miss Marple did not seek vengeance, only understanding, and what she found was a portrait of human grief, disguised as pride, love as loyalty bent by shame. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think it.